Well, why don't we get started? The program says 1 o'clock. But academics know that that always means 1:10 or 1:15. So my name's Charles Faulhaber, and I'm the director of the Bancroft Library, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here today for our I was going to start in Spanish. Bienvenidos al Symposium 1910, Las Revoluciones Inacabadas de México. There will be more Spanish, but I'm going to continue in English. So, 1810, 1910, 2010, Mexico's unfinished revolutions. Before we begin, I want to say a few words about two important Latin American historians who have died recently. This symposium is in fact dedicated to the memory of Adrian Banges of the University of Wyoming. Professor Banges had accepted an invitation to speak here on metaphysics and the Mexican Revolution, an exploration of the neglected metaphysical ramifications of the revolution that highlights the ways in which Mexicans experienced and made sense of the revolutionary process. He was tragically killed in an automobile accident near his home at the beginning of September. He had received his PhD from the University of Texas in 1991 with a pioneering study on the effects of the Mexican Revolution in the state of Sonora in the 1930s, focusing on regional resistance to the reforms of Cárdenas. Later studies, essays focused on anti-clericalism, iconoclasm in a comparative perspective, and as in the paper which was to have been presented here, the meaning of the Mexican Revolution. And just last Saturday, we also lost one of Professor Kouri's colleagues, Friedrich Katz, born in Vienna, educated in Mexico while in exile with his anti-fascist and communist parents, and later in the U.S. He was a towering figure in post-World War II scholarship on Mexico, teaching in Berlin, Mexico, and finally at the University of Chicago. Probably best remembered for two major books dealing with revolutionary Mexico in its first decade. The Secret War, a study of U.S. and European intervention in Mexico, which is also a magnificent analysis of the broad sweep of the revolution, and his biography of Pancho Villa, the result of decades of untiring and dedicated research. In his most recently, Professor Katz was also working on revolutionary Mexico, on Francisco Madera. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. Before we begin, first of all, my heartfelt thanks to Liz Gardner and Diana Vergil, who are sitting back in the corner. Wave so people can see you. They have, yes. They're the people who've made all of this come together, and I would be lost without them. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors. I first want to thank Ambassador Carlos Felix Corona, the Consul General of Mexico in San Francisco, and his staff, particularly Jonathan Chait Auerbach and Andrea Paniagua Borrego. Andrea and Jonathan were going to be here. Have they arrived yet? No, not yet. Okay. But they were instrumental in arranging transportation from Aeromexico for some of our participants. Our colleagues in the Doreen K. Townsend Center for the Humanities and the Center for Latin American Studies provided welcome funding, but I especially want to thank John Gibson, who made a large gift to support the symposium in honor of his late wife, Kate, who was a friend of Bancroft for many, many years. John and I were talking before, about an hour ago, and he had an interesting observation that I'd like him to share with you.
Well, Kate and I met at Berkeley. I won't tell you You have to ask me outside of this later, what year? And she was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. Can't deny that. One of the things about her, and she was very organized, so we set up a list of charities and organizations we donate to, and hers was Bancroft Library. And so each year we send a modest amount to the Bancroft Library. And then later on, when we were older, we had this discussion about who we would bequeath money to when we died. And she said, okay, when she died, I was to bequeath money to the Bancroft. And I was very pleased to do that in her honor. So the thing about it is, I got to thinking, when I was coming here to this symposium, that, it's a shame that we didn't give to the Bancroft while she was alive, because I wish she were here to enjoy the donation. So to anybody who might be in the same boat, where you've discussed with your spouse giving a donation in their honor after they died, do it before they die. And enjoy it together. Anyway, that's just my thought. Now that it's too late for me to do it, I might bring that up to you. It would have been nice, together to share. Anyway, thank you, Charles. And
Thanks, John. As they say, you can't take it with you. I would like to take credit for getting so many distinguished scholars here today, but I can't. My role was limited simply to suggesting to 3 of my colleagues at Berkeley that we ought to put on a symposium to go along with Bancroft's current exhibition called Celebrating Mexico. Unfortunately, it is open this afternoon only until 4 o'clock, and it's not open tomorrow at all because the main library is closed on Saturdays, the effects of the California's budget situation. So if during the break, do go across the way and at least take a peek at the symposium. We also have the catalog for sale at the back. It's $20, including tax, and it's a catalog not only of our exhibition, but also of the joint exhibition that we put together with Stanford. So it really is a wonderful overview of some of the interesting visual aspects of the revolution. The catalog has essays by Yvonne de Valle and Margaret Chowning, who were 2 of the 3 people who helped to organize this. The third was Estelle Terica. Yvonne and Estelle are in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Margaret, of course, in history. They put together a list of probably about 25 people. They said, we really ought to try to get these people to Berkeley. 14 distinguished scholars are here. There were a lot of other ones who would have liked to have come, except for conflicts with other events. For some reason, there are a lot of symposia and conferences on the history of Mexico this year. Outside, there is a selection of books on Mexico and Mexican California that have been published by Bancroft over the years. We are giving them away. We tried to sell them, but we have a whole storehouse, so feel free to take them there. If there's something, well, never mind. It's first come, first serve. We are also circulating a clipboard to those of you who would like to give us your name and email address so that we can send you information about events and lectures at Bancroft. So, Bancroft in Mexico. Hubert Howe Bancroft founded H.H. Bancroft and Company, booksellers and publishers, in 1856 in San Francisco. In 1860, he hired a young clerk, William H. Knight, to compile a handbook almanac of the Pacific Coast. He describes what happens next in his autobiography, Literary Industries. From time to time, he, Mr. Knight, asked of me certain books required for the work. It occurred to me that we should probably have frequent occasion to refer to books on California, Oregon, Washington, and Utah, and that it might be more convenient to have them all together. Accordingly, I requested Mr. Knight to clear the shelves around his desk, and to them I transferred every book I could find in my stock having reference to this country, California. I succeeded in getting together some 50 or 75 volumes. This was the origin of my library, sometimes called the Pacific Library, but latterly the Bancroft Library. Once Bancroft committed himself to documenting the history and development of the new state of California, it became very clear to him that he had to do the same thing for Mexico. The first major acquisitions came from the materials spirited out of Mexico after the execution of Maximilian in 1867. Bancroft acquired 3,000 volumes at the 1869 auction of the collection of the bibliophile José María Andrade. In 1880, when the collection of the first president of Maximilian's government, José Fernández Ramírez, went on the auction block in London, Bancroft acquired almost 1,300 items for $30,000, roughly $600,000 today. These collections were enormously important for documenting Mexico's colonial history, as well as the War of Independence. Shortly afterwards, in 1883, Bancroft made his first trip to Mexico, where, in addition to his collecting activities, he was entertained by Porfirio Díaz. After the University of California acquired the Bancroft Library in 1906, Mexican history continued to be a major focus of our collections. As early as 1911, at the urging of Professor Herbert Bolton, who had come to Berkeley from Stanford, Bancroft embarked on an aggressive program of transcription and then of microfilming archival collections, especially in the Archivo de Indias in Seville and the Archivo General de la Nación. This activity continued for more than 50 years under Bolton, the first full director of Bancroft, and his student George Hammond, who, like Bolton, was a professor of Latin American history. And of particular importance for the last years of the Porfiriato and the Mexican Revolution are the papers of Silvestre Terrazas, a member of a distinguished family from northern Mexico and the publisher of El Correo de Chihuahua. He was deeply involved with politics before and after 1910, was imprisoned 3 times, and spent years in exile in the U.S. All of which is to say is that Bancroft is a wonderful library in which to conduct history, research on Mexican history and society, from the immediate post-conquest days in the 16th century to the present, as I think many of the scholars who are here can attest. You've got the program, I hope. So let's get started. I would like to present Barry Carr of La Trobe University, visiting professor in the Department of History at Berkeley this fall. He's going to be chairing both of our sessions today. The first is on intellectuals, artists, independence, and revolution.
Well, I invite those people on the panel. Let's come up to the table here.
If we're going to have questions at the end of each paper or at the end of the session, and in the interest of giving all of the participants enough, the speakers enough time, we'll hold questions until the end. So do write them down, and the discussion will be in both Spanish and English. So whichever language you feel most comfortable in.
I think people should feel free to either speak from the dais over there, or if you feel more comfortable sitting down. If you had a hard night last night, then I think we can speak from here, because there are microphones on the table. You need to change your slides. So would you prefer to do that from there, or? Okay, fine. Well, we do have a few more minutes. I'm just going to gather my notes, but we'll begin in just one sec here. It's a pleasure, of course, to chair this this session. In fact, the next two sessions. There are three speakers in each of those sessions. This first session, session one, is entitled "Intellectuals, Artists, Independence, and Revolution." And there are three presenters, three ponentes. John Mraz, who will be speaking first. I'm following the program as it's laid out here. Then followed by Robert Irwin, and then followed by Emilio Kouri. The presenters for this conference have been given very strict instructions to speak for 20 to 25 minutes, with 25 minutes being the absolute outer limit here that Sir Charles has very wisely imposed. He's also told me that there is a trap door somewhere there which will be opened at 25 minutes. Well, if that is not in fact the case, I will be imposing that rule pretty strictly, because we do want to have time for comments and discussion at the end of the session. And we're going to be following the practice, as Charles just said, of having the three papers together, and then we'll leave the last, hopefully it'll be at least 15 minutes. If people can keep to 20 minutes, maybe we'll have half an hour, 30 minutes for comments and discussions. So it's my pleasure to welcome the first speaker, who's at the very end there of the table, on my extreme left, just geographically speaking, of course, John Mraz, who's a distinguished historian of Mexico, based currently, has been based for quite some time at the BUAP in Puebla, the University of Puebla. And John is one of the pioneers of historical research using photography. Not only using photography, but submitting photography to all the kind of tough questions that we historians like to throw at our sources. John has had a very impressive publishing career. I'll just mention very briefly three items. A book upon Nacho Lopez, a very famous Mexican photographer. His book, Uprooted Mexican Braceros in the Hermanos Mayo lens, the Hermanos Mayo, another famous group of Mexican photographers. And most recently from Duke University Press last year, Looking for Mexico, Modern Visual Culture and National Identity. So it's with a great deal of pleasure that I ahora le doy la palabra al Dr. Mraz. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Be gentle on John. He's damaged his ribs.
Yeah.
Okay.
I am as old as I look, but I usually don't limp about like this. I just broke them yesterday in Boston. At any rate, thank you, Barry, and thank you, Charles, and thank you, Liz, for the coordination. This talk is one of the fruits of the exhibit that I curated on the centennial of the Mexican Revolution, invited by the INA. That opened in Rome, which I found out online. It evidently will open in DF next month, I guess. What is important is that I wrote a book about it, and that book should be published next month in Spanish, and it will be published by the University of Texas in English in 2002. I'm giving a short version of this talk. Today I'll be giving the long version at UC Santa Cruz on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. But I want to focus on two issues today: the photographers, and specifically the question of their commitment to one or another cause. And secondly, the icons of the photography and their visual history. I feel like I've been engaged in sort of a detective story to reconstruct this, the images of the most photographed revolution in Mexico, and the one of which the most photographs have been conserved. And I would also like to mention there is no book about the photography of any major social revolution in the world. But before we can begin to talk about conceptualizing that, we have to clear away the myths. And the great myth is that Agustin Victor Casasola was the photographer of the revolution. He wasn't. That's a myth that was constructed by the Historias Gráficas. He acquired those photos in any number of ways. He stole some, he bought some. The other thing he did was he shot them magazine, as you can see here. This is a photo by Samuel Tinoco that he shot out of the Illustrated magazine. But if you ask for this photo from the Fototeca Nacional, you'll get a cropped version. So there's really no way of knowing that. Oh, thanks. They can hear me. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. But there's really no way of knowing that by and large until what I did was I emptied the Fototeca Nacional, and I would get 5 versions of the same photo, and a couple of them you'd see the thumbtack, sometimes you'd see a finger holding the images to the wall. In fact, Casasola was a minor photographer in the Porfiriato and in the Revolution, and there were several other photojournalists that were much more important than he was. But even more importantly, rather than the ostensible objectivity of his photography, in fact, the Revolution was photographed by lots of photographers who were committed to different causes. And that, to me, has been the most exciting part of this project, finding agency among the photographers on the slimmest of evidence, the few scattered surviving photographs in archives, the illustrated media that can be located, and chance references that can link a photographer to a cause. Now, the caudillos, all of the caudillos, had a tremendous consciousness of the importance of modern media. And we can illustrate that by looking at this photo. This is how Pancho Villa dressed before a very important media event that had been organized by Madero. You'll notice he's dressed the same as all of his soldiers. After that media event, where he was promoted to a colonel, he began to dress this way, to differentiate himself from his soldiers. Now, one of the things we want to be clear about is there's a big difference between photographing and writing. It costs money to do photographs. So photographers have to be paid for their materials, for their equipment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the Mexican Revolution, one photograph for a caudillo, for an illustrated magazine or newspaper, for postcards, which were very, very important, that were sold to periodicals or that were sold as souvenirs. And there's a revolution. Among other things, what makes the photography of the Revolution unique, of the Mexican Revolution unique, is the fact that you have photographers committed to revolutionary causes that are at war with one another. So the photography of Jesus Abitia, the constitutionalist photographer, is as revolutionary as the photography of Armando Salmerón, Zapata's photographer, or the photography of the Cachu brothers, Villista photographers. Now, I'm not aware that this is the case in any other social revolution in the world. But before we begin, we have some methodological problems. For instance, this is a photo of U.S. troops in Veracruz shortly after April 21, 1914, when the U.S. invaded Veracruz. This is the way you'll get the photo from the Fototeca Nacional. This is the way the photo was published. But this is the way you'll find it in the AGN. You can see here it appears to have been made by Ponciano Flores Perez, a photographer from the port. But there it is, signed by William P. Hadsell, an American who'd been living in Veracruz for 10 years before the revolution. Now, when it was published by Anita Brenner, it was published this way. And you'll notice that she cropped this side. Maybe she was using one of those signed photographs. Maybe not. But she credited it to the Brown brothers. Now, the interesting thing about this photograph is that the semantic debility of photographs, their polysemia, can't even tell us who made it. Maybe it was made by a Mexican to denounce the U.S. invasion, just in case anybody doubted that. Or maybe it was made by a gringo to show a hunter on a tropical safari with his trophies. Now, commitments. The revolution begins on the north with the Madero revolt, and these are Maderistas. Here you can see they've been photographed by, it would appear to have been H.J. Gutierrez. In fact, we've recently discovered that H.J. Gutierrez was an agency. The guy who made this photograph that employed a bunch of photographers, that agency, was Aurelio Escobar. He probably was a Maderista who was interested in covering that rebellion. Gutierrez may only have been interested in making money, because obviously postcards live from being sold. So, and for instance, Mexican photojournalists arrive long after it's all over in the North. Why? Because the Mexican media is subsidized. They don't want to advertise the rebellion against Porfirio Diaz. He also took this, probably long after everything was over. You can see the guys dressed up in their ties. Here you get the fellow with a classic sort of a sword kind of a thing. Almost certainly some young guys they could have even been gringos that crossed over to have their photo taken with a machine gun. Now, Gutierrez might have been interested in the Maderista movement, because here's a photo of people demanding the resignation of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico City around May 23rd, May 25th. We don't really know. Like I say, we're working with very, very slim evidence. The Orozco Rebellion had its own photographer, El Gran Lente, Ignacio Medrano Chavez, who may well have been the most important photographer in the first 50 years of the 20th century in Chihuahua. Here are Orozquistas awaiting the arrival of Orozco. In fact, he appears to have been linked enough to that movement that here he is in a taller mecánico where they made the munitions, and as you can see, for the Artillería Insurrecta, which of course means the Orozquistas. Now, the Zapata movement has normally been conceived of as that which had the least consciousness of the importance of modern media. I've heard some of the visual researchers who I most respect make that claim. That's not true. In fact, Zapata had his own photographer, Armando Salmerón. He took this photograph of Zapata, one of the very few documents we have from a caudillo written to a photographer is one written to Armando Salmerón, where he charges Salmerón to go to a certain place and register the principal points of combat and the leaders, officers, and soldiers of the bad government who fall prisoner. But he wasn't the only Zapatista photographer. Probably the only woman who was really, really involved in photographing. What do you mean? Okay. Probably the only only woman was Sara Castrejon. There's a book that's going to be coming out on her recently, hopefully recently. And Cruz Sanchez. Here's a photograph taken of Zapatistas in Tepoztlan. Now, the guy who is known as the constitutionalist photographer is Jesus Abitia. He had his own caboose to haul his equipment around. He used to go to Havana to buy it. He was a boyhood friend of Álvaro Obregón. Now, he had no problem coming up with money. This is another one here of the cannon that sunk a Huertista battleship, and the reason was because he printed that money with his own photographs. The Villistas were covered probably by the Cachu brothers. This is before they became Villistas. During the Huertista repression, they would hang people that had been Maderista followers, and it was forbidden to take the bodies down, and so they hired the Cachu brothers to go and photograph them, and they would always have somebody holding them so that the face would come out good and clear. Better that kind of a memory than none at all. But that's complicated, because these, to me, appear to be constitutionalist troops. So again, we're going to have to work out, who the Cachu brothers really belong to. And finally, we may even have a Huertista photographer, Eduardo Melado. This is a photograph they say was taken during La Decena Trágica. I suspect it was taken during a reconstruction afterwards. If it was, then that's why. Now, here I want to talk about 5 icons of the revolution, because basically in the exhibit I wasn't interested in leaders, but I am interested in icons. The first is Zapata, with the sash and the sword, taken by Hugo Brema, a German. Where did that sash and sword come from? Well, here we have Manuel Asunsolo, the leader of the Maderista forces in Cuernavaca. That's that same sash and sword. So Zapata putting them on is a way of insisting, I'm the guy who's in charge now. I am a Maderista general. I deserve respect. I deserve legitimacy. Jose Guadalupe Posada made an etching of it very quickly, and it was published in a number of broadsides. That's one of them. When it was finally published, we don't know how Posada saw it, because when it was finally published in a newspaper, it was 1914. Posada had been dead a year, and here it was used simply to say that Zapata was a bandit and Attila of the South. And finally, we see it in this magnificent photograph by Elsa Medina, the day that they signed the reform of the 27th reform and the end of agrarian reform in Mexico. The second one is La Adelita, the consummate soldadera. Now, a few years ago said, well, I don't think she was a soldadera. I think she was a prostitute. Because soldaderas, you got to stir up the pot a little bit, get people to think about images in different ways. Soldaderas went on top of the trains, or they went below the trains. I don't think she was a soldadera. I think she was a food seller. That's the difference between myth and history. You crop the photo, it becomes myth. You show the whole photo, you get the history. I think she was just selling food in the Mexico City train station, and that's why the picture was taken. But from the very first time it was published in 1912, you can see she was labeled a soldadera. Defenderé a mi Juan. What else could you put? ¿Compran mis tortillas? Now, 1942, Gustavo Casasola publishes it as La Soldadera. And here you can see it's La Soldadera Paradigmática, now in another Historiográfica. I felt, even though people criticized the idea that I said she'd been a prostitute, obviously the group of the Trabajadoras Sexuales Independientes liked that idea. And a couple of years ago, they used it in their poster, Seguimos en el Tren. And finally, we have what I call La Adelita Añejada, a great photograph taken by Jose Hernandez Clare. Now, the third icon is Villa on horseback, photograph taken by John Davidson Whelan, an image published in Spain, the US, England, Germany, France, before it could be published in Mexico. Why? Because you can't publish this kind of a photograph until Huerta is out of power. When it's first published in the US, it's a question. Is he a bandit or is he a soldier? Because the US still likes Villa. After he invades Columbus, it's Villa dead or alive. And here you can see the very first time it's published in the US, in the Mexican press. Now he's not a cabecilla, now he's not a bandido, now he's a líder de las fuerzas revolucionarias. And here it is, published in Anita Brenner. And here's a t-shirt I bought coming through Chihuahua a year or so ago. Now, the fourth icon is Villa in la Silla, Villa next to Zapata, a photograph taken on the 6th of December, 1914. They'd been out watching the Convencionista parade. They got tired. They went inside. As Frederick Kotz said, Villa jokingly sat down in the presidential chair for a moment. A photographer recorded the scene, and the picture was spread around worldwide. It's not one picture, it's two. This one is a photojournalist one. Nobody's looking at the camera. This photo was taken by Manuel Ramos. This photo was taken by Antonio Garduño. You'll notice they're both signed by Casasola. Here it is published, where they were very careful not to say anything one way or another about them the day after. Here it is appearing in the Obregón book of 1917, when the armed struggle is still going on. Incredible that he would have included this in his book in 1917. Here it is in Anita Brenner, and here it is in a mural by Arnoldo Belki. And finally, I want to close by looking at the last icon, because it's the last icon to really become an icon. It's until the Villa Huerta en la Penumbra. And this photograph is, in fact, offers a case history of technological failure and revolutionary rescue. What happened here is that the magnesium flash failed, so you don't have any fill light. And so all the light that comes in from the side. Now, what does that mean? Here we can compare the failed photograph and the successful photograph. The successful photograph has no interest whatsoever. It has so little interest that Gustavo Casasola didn't even include it in his 70 pages dedicated to the Huerta regime. Hundreds and hundreds of photos, didn't even include that. Well, why is that photo important? Why did it become important in 1980? Because it works with the aesthetics of film noir. The film made in the United States in the 1940s and the 1950s, from the Maltese Falcon to the Touch of Evil. And what is that? Evil, what are you using? You're using kick lighting, not fill lighting, no? And so what does that do? That creates these very, very sharp shadows that make the bad, that tells us who the bad guys are. This is Lee Marvin in, I forget now, doesn't matter. Anyway, it's Lee Marvin in one of those film noir images. And of course, this was rescued in 1980. It's the sort of the last gasp of the revolutionary historiography, where it's used to paint Huerta as the bad guy of the revolution, which whitens the reputations of the other leaders. Okay, I'm going to end up. And there you can see the successful photo. At any rate, to end up, I'd like to say, photographs of the Mexican Revolution can be analyzed as expressions of the photographer's commitments, and they can be studied in terms of their histories as icons. They can also be used, and this is what I cut out today because you can see what would have happened to me otherwise, as sources of social history. Just as a quick example, you can see the difference between the rifles that Zapatistas carried and the rifles that Constitutionalistas carried. All the rifles that the Zapatistas are carrying are different. That's going to make a big difference in the field of battle. The weapon you're carrying jams. You can't use the weapon your buddy has, even though he's dead, because his ammunition doesn't work in yours. You look at images of the Constitutionalists, they've all got the same weapon, like all modern armies. The weapons, the munitions are interchangeable. If used rigorously, employing the methodologies adequate to the ways in which they are being interrogated, and not relegated to serving as mere illustrations, photographs can open new windows onto yet unknown paths. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, for keeping so firmly within the limits imposed here. You actually still had a couple more minutes to go. Our next speaker is Emilio Kouri. No, I'm sorry, I got the order wrong here. It's Robert Irwin. Sorry, Robert, I sort of should be looking at my notes. Robert, I I think I committed an act of cheek, chutzpah, earlier when I referred to us as historians, or in fact, because we're not all historians here, sort of, even though for some of us history is the master discipline, but Robert is from the Spanish department at the University of California in Davis. I mean, he does do very important literary history work. He's particularly known for his work on the history of gender and sexuality in Mexico. I'll just mention a couple of his major publications. In 2003, Mexican Masculinities, University of Minnesota Press. 2007, Bandits, Captives, Heroines, and Saints, Cultural Icons of Mexico's Northwest Borderlands, which also won a major book prize. He's edited a number of manuscripts, including, I think, most relevant for today. He's edited, I think it's just come out, or it's about to come out, a book on Los 41. The relevance of that will become clear in the talk that's coming up. So it's a welcome to Robert, and his topic is Centenary of Mexican Homophobia, the Mexican Revolution, and the famous 41. So welcome to Robert.
Thank you very much, Barry and Charles and Liz and other colleagues at Berkeley for the invitation to be here today. So my talk is entitled, as you can see, The Centenary of Mexican Homophobia. It's been suggested that the 1901 scandal of the famous 41, which I'll talk a bit about in a few minutes, made possible the incorporation of the male homosexual in the Mexican national imagery. In the popular journalism, as well as literature, and even in scientific discourse, beginning in 1901, the Mexican maricón, a figure completely absent from 19th century Mexican cultural production, suddenly was made eminently visible as a figure projected as simultaneously repulsive and fascinating. However, despite the symbolic value that quickly was attached to the number 41, which continued for many years, beginning in 1910, this national archetype disappeared as rapidly as he had appeared a decade earlier. The Mexican male homosexual suddenly ceased to exist, and the word homosexual, in all its variations, joto, puto, maricón, and 41, became unutterable. Today I'll present an historical summary on the nationalization of the Mexican homosexual man during the Porfiriato, and the new rhetoric of masculinity that from the decade of the 1910s established homophobia as a key element of the national ideology of the Mexican Revolution. In the wee hours of the morning, on November 17th, 1901, the Mexico City police, upon hearing about a clandestine party taking place on La Paz Street, raided the house in question, finding some 41 men half-dressed as women. They arrested them and took them to the police station where they were accused of offending good customs, buenas costumbres. These men, soon to be known as the famous 41, scandalized Mexicans with what had until that moment been an invisible underground world of heterodox sexual tastes and habits. As an immediate and improvised punishment, they were forced to sweep the streets of the city, still clad in their extravagant outfits. Soon afterwards, without being submitted to any legal process, the governor of the federal district ordered them shipped to Yucatan as mess hall workers for the army, which was engaged there in armed conflict with Maya insurgents. The scandal of the 41, which remained in the headlines of the Mexico City press for several weeks, came to define Mexican male homosexuality. In the words of Carlos Monsiváis, and all of these translations are mine, from that moment and until recently, in popular culture, gay is equivalent to transvestite, and there's only one kind of homosexual, an effeminate one. End of quote. More than a mere revelation of unknown practices, the scandal established a new stereotype in the popular imaginary. The 41 never spoke for themselves, and nothing has ever been confirmed regarding their identities, their sexual preferences, their lifestyles, or their experiences. But the scandal triggered a discursive explosion around the figure of the male homosexual, which had been totally repressed from national cultural representations since the colonial era. As the nefarious sin, pecado nefando, had been one of the main justifications for the spiritual conquest of the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, an infraction pursued insidiously by the Inquisition, the notion of sexual desire for those of the same sex remained profoundly repressed through the entire 19th century in Mexico. As I've argued on several occasions, most notably in my book, Mexican Masculinities, there was a lack of consciousness of the possibility of sexual relationships between men in the Mexican national imaginary, which made possible, paradoxically, expressions of intimate affection, of obsessive friendship, and even of homoeroticism between men as a commonplace in the Mexican literature of the 19th century, where there are even cases of men sleeping together under truly queer circumstances, which no other word would really describe in many cases. Examples that I analyze in that text: El Periquillo Sarmiento by Fernández de Lizardi, Clemencia by Altamirano, Astucia by Inclán, Hermana de los Ángeles by Del Castillo, Los Mariditos, and also Historia de Chucho el Ninfo by Cuellar, El Fistol del Diablo by Paino, among others. I'm citing here an important chunk of the national literary canon of the 19th century narrative fiction. A rereading of 19th century Mexican literature, its national foundational fictions, that takes note of the many queer or queer-looking scenes may shock contemporary readers for this canon's not very hidden homoeroticism, which I illustrate here with a painting by Ángel Zárraga. In 1901, Mexico's sexual landscape changed definitively with the scandal of the 41. The rapid modernization of the city was bringing about a range of revisions to traditional gender roles, and the scandal of the 41 was, in many ways, one more incident in the zeitgeist of the era with regard to questions of sexual diversity, an important theme of modernist and naturalist literature and of the positivist scientific production of the period. Although there's a tendency to think about modernism as a reaction against the positivist predisposition to quantify, the two schools of thought and cultural production actually coincided in their obsession with themes of sexual perversion. As for the specific theme of male homosexuality, the Oscar Wilde trial, whose coverage in Mexico City newspapers evoked shock and disgust in 1895, gave rise to the discourse that made possible the discursive explosion of 1901. Homosexuality was recognized as an important problem of the times in 1895, but only in 1901 did this problem become a national one, a Mexican one. And in contrast with the simultaneous visibilization of transvestism in Argentina, for example, where homosexuality was treated as a mere pose, an imitation of an attitude that belonged to European, Italian, or French, but not American decadence. In Mexico, no one ever accused the 41 of imitating foreign vices. Instead, they were portrayed as a new national phenomenon, as can be seen clearly in their first visual representation, that of the series of engravings of them by José Guadalupe Posada, recounting the three key moments of the scandal. The drag ball, which we saw a little earlier, their public humiliation, and their send-off to Yucatan. The 41 turned out to be some of the dandies who were seen daily strolling along Platero Street, which is a reference from El Popular in its coverage of the 1901 scandal. That is, they were very familiar Mexican faces. They were not an import, but merely something new, as the 41 announced a new century-style ball, un baile estilo nuevo siglo, another quote from El Popular. Even their punishment was carried out in a markedly Mexican context. They were not sent into exile, but were conscripted into the army. Meanwhile, homosexuals began to appear as protagonists of Porfirian sexual life. The criminologist Carlos Romagnac, author of 3 studies that sought out the causes of criminality in Mexico in the epoch through interviews with and readings of case files of prisoners in Mexican jails, discovered examples of homosexual behavior everywhere he looked. Romagnac employed somewhat nebulous or eclectic methods, as historian Rob Buffington put it in his Criminal and Citizen in Modern Mexico, to determine the sexual habits of Mexican criminals, poring over records of physical examinations of genitals to identify what he called the physical characteristics that mark the habit of active pederasty that he was able to find in the case of Andres D. I can't imagine what would be the physical characteristics that mark the habit of active pederasty, but he knew what they were. Or interpreting the transparent ears. You can't really see how transparent they were in this photo, but the transparent ears of a young prisoner as a sign of his addiction to masturbation. This is from his book, Crímenes Sexuales y Pasionales. The popular press, for its part, informed an insatiable public of scandals of drag balls and published endless double entendre jokes implicating various public figures as effeminate or homosexual. And here's another one from another scandal of the time. In the public sphere, the homosexuality that never was mentioned and perhaps was never even really conceptualized privately in prior decades suddenly became ubiquitous, threatening everyone. In a satiric engraving on the implicit changes in traditional gender roles as a result of the new presence of women in public spaces, José Guadalupe Posada illustrated the anxiety of Mexicans at sensing this change. Titled Feminism Imposes Itself, El Feminismo se impone, the engraving represents several Mexican men carrying out, as you can see, various everyday activities associated with the figure of the housewife, ironing, embroidering, cooking, etc., positioned all over a huge number 41. In 1906, Eduardo Castrejon, a pseudonym of General Mariano Ruiz Montañez, who was the first governor of Nayarit, and who was also a congressman during the last decade of the Porfiriato, published a popular novel titled Los 41, una novela crítico-social. This novel adopted many elements of the style of the popular yellow press in its treatment of the 41 scandal and its mocking tone and the hyperbolic derision with which it treats its protagonists, cartoon-like figures with names like Mimi, Ninon, Virtud, and Pudor. At the same time, the novelist is unable to avoid obsessively exploring the details of cross-dressing, the thrill of donning women's clothing, the styles of clothing, shoes, and jewelry, the application of makeup, and the profound pleasure felt by the transvestites in the clearly liberating space of their subculture. The novel, which announced itself as being one of social criticism in the tradition of El Periquillo Sarmiento, is the first novel with an overtly queer theme in the history of Mexican literature, although it should be noted that this is no gay novel, but rather an anti-gay novel, at least on the surface. The novel employs a pretentiously floral linguistic register, but is much more akin to the style to the scandal sheets than to the major literary trends of the era, and really this really has little, if anything, to do with Mexican modernismo. Just to illustrate, I have a couple of images from Julio Ruelas, the great modernist illustrator of the era. However, it should be noted that thematically it fits right in with modernismo's fascination with the perverse, especially the sexual heterodox. Although Mexican literature of the era is rarely explicit in addressing the taboo theme of homosexuality, the only important example being the inclusion of a lesbian character in Federico Gamboa's naturalist novel Santa, male homosexuality does enter implicitly into modernist prose in the work of Amado Nervo. Nervo, author of a crónica titled El Ser Neutro, a poem Andrógino, and a vignette Hermafrodita, seems to have been obsessed for a time with the question of gender and sexual roles, a theme that he develops most fully in his novel El Donador de Almas, which portrays a relationship of exceptional affection, in his words, cariño excepcional, between two male friends who believe that every man needs a man, a quote from the novel. This novel's fantastic element allows it to explore this friendship and the psychology of one of these two men in unexpected ways, including most prominently its representation through this character of the well-known turn-of-the-century trope of the woman's soul in a man's body. This obsessive fascination with male homosexuality in the first decade of the century suddenly disappears from the discursive landscape beginning in 1910, the year that Romagnac published his final study linking criminality and sexual degeneration, Matadores de Mujeres. Meanwhile, the second part of the famous 41 novel, advertised on the back cover of the 1906 book, apparently never came out, and the first part quickly fell into oblivion. Neither the novel nor its author have ever been mentioned in any Mexican literary history, and it seems that the novel was completely lost until 1990, when a single copy was discovered in the Fondo Rafael Eliodoro, in the 1990s rather, when a single copy was discovered in the Fondo Rafael Eliodoro Valle, in the Special Collections section of Mexico's National Library. Valle is another interesting figure who has not been studied very much, but who had a very interesting collection that he donated to the Biblioteca Nacional. And although knowledge of the novel's existence circulated in Mexico in certain circles, for many years this novel existed as little more than an urban legend, until finally a truncated bilingual edition came out in the United States in 1903. We did that at Tulane when I was there. Posada, meanwhile, died in 1913, Amado Nero in 1919. The Mexican cultural sphere would reconfigure itself in completely new terms in the 1920s. Its protagonists would be a new generation of writers and artists who would promote new values associated with the rupture caused by the Mexican Revolution. And these new values would repress interest, which had so intensified in the last years of the Porfiriato, in sexual transgression, or heterogeneity, or diversity. The number 41 would continue signifying male homosexuality, but homosexuality would no longer be represented in Mexican cultural production. Indeed, signifying processes of the number 41 would be mostly negative. No longer would the newspapers be full of playful references to the famous 41 drag ball. Instead, the number itself would cease to be used in both official and casual contexts, a reflection of a pronounced paranoia. Former Revolutionary General Francisco Urquizo writes, "There's no army division, regiment, or battalion that bears the number 41. They go up to number 40 and from there skip to 42. There's no list with a 41 line. There are no cities with the label that label a house number 41. In the worst case, if there's no other choice, they'll use 40B. There's no hotel or hospital room with a number 41. No one celebrates a 41st birthday. From 40, they skip to 42. No automobile has a license plate numbered 41, nor will police or other government agents accept this number." This is from a text from the 1960s. Mexico's obsessive curiosity about male homosexuality inverts itself, becoming an obsessive paranoia that censors the idea from cultural discourse, except in the most veiled terms. In Mariano Azuela's Los de Abajo, the most emblematic novel of the Mexican Revolution, the concept of male homosexuality cannot be mentioned. The accusation that city slicker is nothing more than a puntos suspensivos remains incomplete, self-censored. Homosexuality is only represented by its erasure. I've previously argued that the notion of Mexican masculinity was configured in these years, and the values associated with fraternity and civilization that produced idealizations of male friendship and elevated the man of letters, thinker, father, poet, husband, provider, erudite statesman, as a model of national masculinity in the 19th century, could no longer be sustained when upper-class cultured men became protagonists in a scandalous drag ball. The prudent, peaceable, sophisticated man that expressed his frank affection for his male friends fell from grace as his masculinity came into question for its possible homosexual tendencies. I'm illustrating with a painting by Manuel Rodriguez Lozano. The masculinity promoted in the post-revolutionary period is no longer that of illustrated scholars, but that of rough revolutionary heroes. And this new macho man had no pretensions of being civilized, instead being impulsive, violent, and always aggressively homophobic. The word macho, which still referred mainly to male animals and was applied to humans only in a disparaging manner during the Porfiriato, was radically resignified. A tension that began to emerge in the years immediately prior to the revolution, exemplified, for example, in Luis Urbina's Crónica titled Los Valientes y la Civilización, Tough Guys and Civilization, resolves itself in post-revolutionary culture through a new national value of explicit homophobia. It seems that the Mexican Revolution is a landmark moment in the history of Mexican homophobia. It makes the frank representation, even from a critical perspective, of male homosexualities in Mexican national culture. It erases that, rather. This new machismo is characterized by a homophobia that approaches paranoid proportions. When Martín Luis Guzmán writes, Mexican politics conjugate only one verb, madrugar, to strike down. That's from La Sombra del Caudillo. He's articulating a whole new ideology of gender in which any trace of a possible affection between men becomes a possible homosexualizing contamination. Mexican men don't allow themselves to be vulnerable, no se rajan, because vulnerability implies being beaten down, madrugado, or more popularly, fucked, chingado. A man that allows himself to be chingado risks falling into the symbolic sexual role of the chingado, a feminized, homosexualized man. As Carlos Monsiváis put it, if the revolution creates spaces of development of a distinct sensibility, the revolutionaries also flaunt a rampant machismo. Then in parentheses, he adds, I don't use the term homophobia as this is a term corresponding to a time when it negatively qualifies an irrational hatred for homosexuals. Before that, when everyone shared the attitude, there's no point in specifying. End of quote. In the early years of the Mexican post-revolution, there are no longer any homosexual characters in Mexican national literature. The first more or less clearly homoerotic representations in Mexican poetry are depicted through figures characterized by their invisibility or absence, as is the case with the homoerotic poems in Javier Villarrutia's Nostalgia de la Muerte. When Octavio Paz declared in 1950 that it would not be difficult to note certain homosexual inclinations in the Mexican macho, it's a piece of a quote from El laberinto de la soledad. The observation seems to come from nowhere, although in his longer discussion of the albur and the word chingar, he clarifies things, declaring that, and I'm quoting Paz, Mexican homosexuality is tolerated as long as it consists of a violation of a passive agent. And in the case of heterosexual relations, what is important is not opening oneself and simultaneously cracking, rajar, or injuring the other guy. End of quote. This constant tendency to conceive of relations, whether symbolic, personal, or sexual, in terms of the verb chingar, with one man always positioned as active in an act of homosexual rape, came to define Mexican masculinity in such a way that it became difficult to delimit an absolute border between pure or complete masculinity and the feminized masculinity that is contaminated by the insinuation of homosexuality. Thus, it is only in the 1960s that the symbol 41 reappears in Mexican literature in the novel 41 o El hombre que soñaba en fantasmas by Paulo Poe, the novel that launches the cycle of so-called gay novels in Mexico, which begins with a series of largely underground books that only came out of the closet in 1979, with the gay rights movement informed and supported publication of Luis Zapata's daring El vampiro de la colonia Roma. I don't wish to say by any means that the Porfiriato represented a period of greater solidarity for homosexuals. The situation is just the opposite. Homophobia was about universal, and the information that circulated about homosexuality, whether in the press and literature or even in scientific texts, reflected little more than the prejudices and ignorance of the era. There exist no descriptions or portraits of homosexuals from the era that in any way approach verisimilitude, but we can find excellent, very credible representations of the era's homophobia. But the Porfiriato's homophobia, nonetheless, is intertwined with the era's relentless attraction for the theme, whereas after the revolution, homophobia becomes institutional, becoming incorporated implicitly into the constructions of a nationalism founded upon coarse machismo. In this sense, the Mexican Revolution transforms male homosexuality from a mere social or moral problem into an anti-national category. For all these reasons, I'm proposing in this year of centennials and bicentennials that we recall the ball of the 41 transvestites of 1901. This ball actually was commemorated in Mexico last month with the publication of the first Mexican edition since 1906 of Eduardo Castrejon's lost novel, Los 41. la Coordinación de Difusión Cultural de la Dirección de Literatura de la UNAM, finally reissued the novel with my brief preliminary study and a prologue by the late Carlos Monsiváis. Its republication at this moment, one of both the bicentennial and also shrill polemics on the various aspects of the legalization of the gay family, rights of marriage, adoption, etc., in Mexico and in Argentina and in California and in so many other places, is opportune. Today there is much more tolerance and in some spaces even comprehension of sexual diversity. However, what is most remarkable about the novelized Legend of the 41 is the lack of consideration for the perspective of the accused, the 41 maricones. No one allowed them to speak, to defend themselves, to explain their story. There was not even a trial to record their testimonies, but rather an order from the governor to expel them from the city. They were punished without any consideration of basic rights. Today we have tolerance, but at the same time, we keep hearing of cases, all in the recent news, of torture, murder, bullying, teen suicides, rhetoric of asquito, all backed by a homophobic rhetoric that, just as it did in Castrejon's novel, ridicules, stereotypes, disparages, and dehumanizes homosexuals. In our reedition of Castrejon's novel, we aim not for a celebration of the advances of the gay rights movement, but a protest against the institutionalized homophobia that continues to affect us every day, that continues seeking to deny us civil rights 100 years later. And if anyone is interested, I brought along a couple of copies of this book that's just come out, which I'm selling. You can't get it yet, not even at Gandhi, I don't think. It's really just come out. I also have two copies of the edition we did several years ago, which is a bilingual edition. It also includes the Monsiváis essay as well as several essays by some other historians, if anyone's interested. So thank you very much.
Paper and the una pequeña propaganda at the end, so don't miss up on that opportunity. And our third and final speaker in this session is Emilio Kouri from the University of Chicago. Emilio's title is Indians and Revolution in Mexico. Emilio's been teaching at the University of Chicago for quite some time. He's known for a number of his publications, particularly a prize-winning book, Puebla Divided, which is a study of Papantla, and which won the Bolton Johnson Prize. He's the co-editor most recently of a book about Revolución y Exilio en la Historia de México, which is, I think, co-edited with Javier García Diego of El Colegio de México. He's been editing recently collections of essays about Molina Enriquez, founding director of the CUTS Center of Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago. One, I'm sure, of many references that we'll be making during the course of this symposium to the life and career of Friedrich Kac. So welcome to Emilio.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I want to start by thanking the Bancroft and Charles and Margaret and all of you. As you can see, I have no pictures. And I also have a cough, so forgive me if I stumble along the way. I'm not going to try to read my paper. It would be, I would be chased out of here by Barry. And so I'll try to summarize it instead, which inevitably leaves out a lot of the detail, but if you're interested, then you can ask about it. It really tries to answer from the perspective of intellectual history one question. What did the revolution do for Indians? And what I do is try to outline what has been for a long time the standard answer to that question, and then I go ahead and try to raise doubts about the strength or validity of that answer and suggest some other alternatives. Before I get to that, in a minute, let me just start simply by raising, not really answering, but raising some questions obvious, important questions of definition, which will always be important in thinking about this. And the most obvious one is, what do we mean by Indian? And that's a question that's very difficult to answer. The definition has changed dramatically over time from originally in the context of New Spain, a legal definition, eventually also, and still I think in some ways, a racial definition. But then increasingly in the 20th century, it acquired a much more cultural tinge, and in technical terms nowadays, at least from a census perspective and that often of anthropologists, it has also a linguistic basis. In other words, in the Mexican census, an indigenous person is someone who speaks the indigenous language, period. And so these ones are change over time, they overlap. There's also a significant difference between our own understandings at different times as scholars of what indigenous means and how people use the term at the time. So for example, if we think about the Mexican Revolution and ask, what was the participation of indigenous people in the revolution? If you take a social science perspective on it, that is a linguistic definition of it, or even perhaps a cultural one, you would say it was fairly minimal. But if you asked the press in Mexico City, well, all of Zapata's troops and Zapata himself were, barbaric Indians. And so from their perspective, Indians were agitating in the countryside, although it's, I think, quite easy to argue that at least Zapata himself and many of those close to him most clearly did not think of themselves as being indigenous, and would have been unhappy at being characterized that way as they were in the press in Mexico City. So, there are all these different ways of thinking about the question, and the answer is going to change dramatically depending on how you define it. There's also a larger problem, which has to do with the way in which the concept of the indigenous and the mestizo sort of blend in and come together in the 20th century and already by the late 19th century, so that the question of, what is indigenous about the mestizo, or what is the difference between an indigenous person and a mestizo, is a really thorny one. If you take a radical view, for example, that taken by Guillermo Bonfil, the famous anthropologist in the 1980s, every mestizo is an indigenous person who doesn't know it. In other words, I mean, that is to say, we ought to think of mestizos as alienated indigenous people who ought to come to terms with their real cultural roots. I mean, that's a radical view, but the point is, there is clearly a connection, and it's one that is really fought over. So the subject is a problematic one. In my question, that's really what I want to say. And I think also historically, and this is in comparison to other Latin American countries, it is important to say that, and I'll say somewhat bluntly, for the sake of expedience, that in Mexico there really has never been a sort of pan-indigenous self-identity. Unlike in other parts of Latin America. I mean, certainly if one thinks of Bolivia today, or even Guatemala, where that is the case. That is to say that while it was a colonial legal term, self-identification in Mexico has always been and continues to be, for the most part, even after 1994 in Chiapas, largely based on ethnic identities, on specific ethnic identities. There have been efforts, along the lines of what's happened elsewhere in Latin America to form pan-indigenous movements in Mexico and to create an identity. But I mean, most people, except recently and in a small sense, did not, certainly historically, think of themselves in that way as indigenous. Maybe they were Mixtecos or Mayas or Zapotecos, and that's an important distinction that is obvious, that is often forgotten when talking about these things. So I have more to say about that, but I just wanted to put that up front and say, well, this whole discussion really is predicated on a very slippery term, and I'll leave that there. Now, what is the standard view of what the Mexican Revolution did for Indians? Well, in a nutshell, the revolution is presented as a great watershed moment. That is, the rise of revolutionary indigenismo marks a before and an after in the relationship between not just intellectuals, but more broadly the nation and its indigenous population. it was a great moment of reevaluation of the worth of indigenous people, of their contribution to the greatness of Mexican civilization, and a renewed effort was made to move away from, at least rhetorically, from the sort of overt discrimination and rejection of the past to the exclusionary ways of thinking about the place of indigenous people in the national life to something very different, that is Mexico, or so the argument goes, began to take consciousness of this in the revolution and to propose to do something, as the main advocate of this would say, Manuel Gamio, to integrate indigenous people. And that, so the argument goes, was a radical departure from a long history of, at least anyway, going back to independence, although with all the roots clearly, of an inability to incorporate, to digest, as it were, sort of what to do with indigenous people, and various schemes in the course of the 19th century that essentially had to do, mental schemes really for the most part, that had to do with how to get rid of them, how to dissolve them, how to turn them into something else. And so in this view, indigenismo represents, a new beginning. I mean, and clearly all revolutions like to imagine themselves as tabula rasas of some sort. This one is no exception. And what's striking in some respects is the way in which, at least in a lot of circles and for a long time, this was a more or less accepted view with very few qualms represented. Within that reconsideration of the indigenous, again, in opposition to, in particular, the sort of scientific racism that had characterized Porfirian intellectual life. I mean, so what makes the watershed so interesting is sort of the abruptness, or so the argument goes, so that change from the height of scientific racism to a re-engagement with that significant segment of the Mexican population on different terms, and where, as Gamio would himself argue, where the state, the new revolutionary state, would take a leading role, and this was in this process of integration. And here, as I've suggested, the key figure, or at least the one I'm going to talk about today, there are others, I think, in fact, that are more interesting, like Moisés Sáenz, but the key figure, because of his prominence, was Manuel Gamio. And, the pivotal text, cited in this context is his 1916 pamphlet, Forjando Patria, or Making the Motherland, or the Fatherland, which was precisely about how, Mexico could not become a modern nation if it didn't take into account its indigenous people. It couldn't make them go away. It couldn't destroy them. It couldn't dissolve them into whiteness. I mean, as other Latin American countries has hoped to do. It couldn't because it failed to successfully promote white immigration from Europe. The Brazilians had done it, and others, Argentines had done it, but Mexico could never do it. So let's now squarely address this issue and recognize that, A, there are great values and strengths to be found in our own indigenous population, and let's make a modern nation that incorporates them in some way. And how he proposes to do that is a different question that we can get to later. So in this view, it's a significant, profound turn against the old racism, against the old, bourgeois Porfirian cosmopolitanism, which sort of belittled, Mexico's native peoples, at least their contemporary heirs, because by then already the Aztecs and others were being glorified as what was distinctive about Mexico, and that was part of the interesting contradiction. And an end, at least rhetorically once again, to this historic effort to exclude, to marginalize, and to build a nation that somehow or another would come together without them. So this is, again, simplifying somewhat sort of what the view is. And although indigenismo faltered and was not as, energetic as one would have hoped and so on, there it was, and this is one of the significant ways in which the revolution changed things. And you could begin to see that, or so the argument would go in the emergence of more positive images of the indigenous in the muralistas, in the media, and so on and so forth. And that is seen as sort of part of a sort of zeitgeist that is changing somehow there around 1915, 1916. What I'd like to suggest here, and what I argue in this text, is that the intellectual novelty of indigenismo has been greatly exaggerated. That is to say, that if one looks closely at it, in many ways it is better read and I mean to say this to provoke you, it is better read, or there's more continuity with the old Porphyrian views on the indigenous question than there are breaks. It's a matter of balance, but there it is. But the revolution clearly is a new beginning, and any connections with the past have to be forgotten. But the connections are striking. And in some ways, what I argue here is that much of what Gamio did, with some significant or small changes, was something that was well underway already in Mexico by 1910. By those, precisely in the hands of those who would now be represented as being the antithesis of that. I mean, the old scientific racists, supposedly they weren't really many of them. They couldn't be. It was difficult to be a true scientific racist in Mexico because it was kind of committing suicide. I mean, if you really believed in scientific racism, then you might as well kill yourself because Mexico had no way out as a nation. And that gets you, to thinking more pragmatically when you're faced with that kind of situation. So most of these Porphyrian intellectuals really very quickly realized that scientific racism, whatever they were saying in Europe, was not something that they really wanted to buy into very much because it left them with no hope. And that's always the last thing to go. So the novelty has been greatly exaggerated. I argue that, and I also argue, and I don't know if I'll get to this here today, but I'll mention it, that in addition to that, the practical application of indigenismo, at least through the 1940s, was almost insignificant. That is to say that whatever view one takes of this ideological movement, whether it was really a dramatic break or a significant continuity, when you look at the ways in which, through the actions of the state, it impacted native populations in the first 30 or so years of the revolution, you would have to come to the conclusion that it didn't really matter. Because it didn't have because it didn't reach almost any indigenous people, and where it did, it did it with very mixed results. After 1940, in a very different set of circumstances and a sort of in a retooled intellectual context, indigenismo would have, a much more practical application and arguably a more significant impact in certain parts of Mexico, but not before. So, in other words, what I'm saying is, it really is an outgrowth of Porphyrian intellectual discourse, for the most part, and in any case, was beyond the talk, which is not insignificant, but there it is, the lives of indigenous people in Mexico were really not touched by indigenismo in any significant way. And therefore, and this is the last part of the paper, which I definitely won't get to, if one has to answer the question of how the revolution changed or affected Indians in Mexico, then talking about indigenismo is completely the wrong way to go. Then you really have to start looking about other things. You have to look at social questions, economic questions. You might, if you want to talk about government action, pay more attention to land reform, than you would at indigenismo and the new institutions of the state devoted to studying and dealing with the indigenous problem. But that part I won't get into. Now, yes. Let me then frame this very quickly. The problem of the relationship between race and nation was an old one. And what I argue is that the framing of it that took place in the late 19th century was exactly the same one that the indigenistas took and accepted. That is, that the nation had to be homogeneous, and that, in the language of positivism, that the nation was an organic body that developed and evolved, and the quality of it would depend essentially on the quality of its parts. So to the extent that it was united, homogeneous, that people were the same kind, the nation had a much larger potential for advanced development. Hybridized places, mongrelized places really were not going to evolve very far or develop very far. The problem then in Mexico was what to do with the fact that this was indeed, a nation of mixed races, of a variety of people. And the Porphyrians already, as I said, had dealt with this question very directly and had come up, I would argue, with more or less the same answers that the indigenistas would later argue. If you look at the origins of the mestizo ideology of the notion that the mestizo is really the embodiment of Mexican nationality, you can look at Vasconcelos, it's usually the popular place to find it, but in fact it's already in the discourse of a great number of Porphyrians in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, this is the solution. Well, maybe mixtures are not good, are not bad, but actually are good, and and there's a great series of sort of intellectual arguments for that. That is essentially then what the revolution would do, but it already was in place, not only in Andrés Molina Enriquez, but Justo Sierra himself, and many others were already essentially arguing by 1900, that Mexico had to make mestizaje a great sort of source of its strength and not, as Spencer, say, for example, would have argued, a source of degeneration. So that was there. Education, well, Sierra is the best example of that. I mean, the indigenistas, in the first 20, 25 years, that's what they would do, concentrate on education and language and so on. That was already there, very much in place by the Porfiriato. And then, of course, the Porfirians had a whole immigration agenda, a whitening agenda, which did get abandoned by the revolution because, in fact, it had been remarkably unsuccessful in the Porfiriato, since people who were coming to the Americas were going to the United States or Argentina or Brazil and were not going to Mexico, period. Had that been different, maybe the story would have been a different one. So the Porfiriato had already dealt with these things and was already doing a number of significant things in that respect. I mean, the research done at the Museo Nacional very much represents an important background to the kind of work the indigenistas would do. The archaeological projects, in fact, would too. And the figure most closely associated with Gamio, and I better get to this before my time runs out, that is Franz Boas, and the argument that Gamio represents a big break. In fact, you have to remember that Gamio was brought to Mexico in 1911 at the foundation of the International School of Archaeology and Ethnology by the Porfirians themselves, and Edward Seller as well. And it is, so it's already the Porfirians who are bringing Boas. Now, of course, the revolution breaks in that year, and all hell breaks loose. But in reality, they were already sort of moving in the direction of the kinds of things that Franz Boas was writing about. Now, very quickly then, in the story, the traditional story, Manuel Gamio represents the change, the moment of change. And why? It's mainly because of his association with Franz Boas, the father of cultural relativism. Gamio is seen in Mexico as the man who rejects the old evolutionism of the Porfirians, the one who rejects the arguments about the centrality and immutability of race, and embraces a relativism, cultural difference that is a wave of the future, and that opens for Mexico the possibility of imagining itself as a modern nation without being, without having to deal with its racial problem. Gamio was a student of Boas at Columbia University. He was one of the first Mexicans, or maybe the first, I don't know, to get a PhD in anthropology at Columbia. Boas came to Mexico, to work at this school for a number of summers in 1911 and 1912. And so, and Gamio himself paid homage to the fact that he was influenced by Boas. Now, what I argue here is that if you look closely, in fact, the embrace of Boas's cultural relativism by Gamio was very, very limited, even though he himself promoted the idea that it was. That is, there are two elements here of this kind of new cultural relativism that would transform anthropology and transform the thinking about race and nation in the 20s and 30s and 40s, which were quite distinctly rejected by Gamio and by the indigenistas. The first one has to do with the question of language. Because where Boas was clearly in favor of linguistic diversity, Boas really did believe, although he didn't abandon entirely the notion of race, that there was no gradation of cultures, that there was no cultural evolution, all there was cultural difference. This is something that Gamio and his colleagues in Mexico could not accept. They gave up the whole idea of cultural inferiority. That was great progress, although some Porfirians had done that, and turned it into an idea of cultural backwardness. Now, backwardness you can fix. Inferiority you can't. And that was a big difference. But backwardness still meant a gradation of culture, so you could actually locate different Mexican indigenous cultures along a kind of ranking, something that Boas already was rejecting very explicitly by these years. The second point worth highlighting here, and is fundamental to the characterization of Mexican indigenismo, has to do with the question of nationalism. Franz Boas, and I can't get into it now because of his own background as a European Jew who was an exile in the United States, and his whole anthropology was openly and fiercely anti-nationalist. Whereas what Gamio was doing was precisely the opposite, that is putting this project of cultural study and analysis to the service of nationalism, of the new nationalism of the revolution. And if you read the correspondence between Gamio and Franz Boas, you see this tension very clearly there, that Boas essentially can see how Gamio is using his own ideas for a very, very different goal. And finally, as I suggested, that the evolutionism, that characterized this kind of racialist thinking in the 19th century and that Boas moved away from was something that Gamio and a lot of his Mexican colleagues really did want to hold on to as a way of thinking about practical ways of civilizing and integrating indigenous people to Mexican culture. So that in sum, in Gamio and some of his colleagues, the language of race, though less markedly important than it had been for the Porphyrians, and the language of evolution would persist and would continue to be important. And it is much more, I think, insightfully read as part of a continuity with the kind of Porphyrian developments. That's a significant break. That is, in a nutshell, what the paper argues with, I hope you'll trust me, a lot more subtlety than I can reproduce here. And then I go on in the last couple of minutes to say then that if you look then at what the indigenistas did in the 1920s and 30s and up until after Lázaro Cárdenas was president, you would begin to wonder why it is that so much has been made about the revolutionary transformations brought about by the early indigenismo. They were very ambitious in their goals, but their success was very limited in this early period because of lack of budgets, because of disagreements among them, about questions of how to bring about the cultural integration of indigenous people. Mexican intellectual history, and with this I'll finish, about the racial thinking, about the indigenous question would advance more clearly, would make more sense, would be better understood if we, as much as people will resist this, do away with the idea that the revolution represented a very significant break when, in fact, it did not. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Well, thanks for our three speakers. We're actually on time. We even finished a couple of minutes. Charles, did you want to say a word?
Only the microphone. Only that we are recording this for later webcasting. So if you want to ask a question, we'd ask you, we've got people who will circulate with microphones.
Okay, I'm going to invite questions and comments. We only have 18 minutes if we want to have our full 30-minute coffee and tea break. So I'm going to ask you, please, to identify yourself very briefly and say to whom your question is directed, and no long speeches. Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm pointing to you, so yes.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Gareth Williams. I have, I think, two questions. The first question is to include, I think, John Mraz and Robert Irwin, and then the second question is for Emilio Kouri. I'm struck by one thing about the images that we've seen and the revolutionary images, and the idea that these images are in fact revolutionary, is just how strikingly unrevolutionary the images are themselves in aesthetic terms. And it seems to me that there's a very interesting tension there between your two papers at the beginning, between what appears to be the pre-revolutionary moment of an opening, let's say, in Mexico City, versus the post-revolutionary closure in Robert Irwin's talk. And then the idea, I was struck by the idea that this is a moment clearly of technological reproducibility that's kicked in, and that I thought it was very striking that the most interesting photograph, at least, was the Huerta photograph at the end, which is thanks to technological failure. And so I'm just wondering if we can, what we can do with that idea of technological reproducibility and technological failures in its relationship to a revolutionary aesthetic. And then, of course, the question of opening and closure in Robert Irwin's talk is very, very important, I think. In terms of Emilio Kouri's talk, I think that there's an interesting discourse here about, essentially about humanism and the place of the intellectual history of humanism in Mexico in relationship to race. By the late 1930s, Alfonso Reyes returns to Mexico and writes El Pasado Inmediato, where he's recuperating this image of the revolution in very Porphyrian terms. And so I think that my question there might be, to what extent it might be important to kind of revisit that continuity of thought through thinkers such as, you mentioned Vasconcelos, but I'm also thinking of Enriquez Ureña and Alfonso Reyes, who are definitely, whose part of their project is to construct a notion of national Mexican subjectivity in which indigeneity, for example, doesn't form part. So we have very much an ideological articulation of indigenismo versus what you were talking about, which is the practicality, the application of indigenismo.
Thanks, Gareth. Question for everybody.
Okay, to begin with, the Mexican Revolution was photographed largely by professional photographers. And basically, they were studio photographers. You're dealing with very big cameras that often have to be mounted on tripods. You see a development. I think you see a development in their photography, but that's not really up until around 1915. Very few photojournalists leave Mexico City to cover the revolution. So the most experimented people that would be doing spontaneous photography simply aren't out there to do that. They're studio photographers that link themselves to various causes, and they slowly learn how to photograph spontaneously. And I would just like to mention, really probably for me, the most developed photographer of the Mexican Revolution is in fact Hugo Brema, a German who ended up there in 1906. But I cut that out of this talk. I'll be talking about Hugo Brema in Santa Cruz. Often when people talk about aesthetics, they want to talk about Tina Modotti and Manuel Alvarez Bravo the same way they want to talk about Corda and Corrales in Cuba. That's post-revolutionary photography. I'm interested in the photography of the armed struggle.
I'll just give a quick answer to the question about the opening and closing metaphor. My presentation, as maybe any 20-minute talk, simplifies things a lot. And if one looks closer, one finds paradoxes. And so my focus was on the homophobia that emerged, that existed already from the moment of the famous 41, but took a very fixed national form after or with the revolution. But at the same time, that kind of is represented as a closing. But at the same time, the scandal of the 41 and the discursive explosion that it represented also represented a kind of an opening. It's what allowed for homosexual identities, for example, to be assumed for the first time, I think. And you can see that in the generation following the revolution, in the generation of poets of the contemporaneous, Villarrutia, Salvador Novo, and others, in the kind of underground that starts to exist in Mexico City following the revolution. So kind of two things happening at once.
That exploring these continuities would be quite beneficial. You know, there are, at the same time, you know, changes taking place, no question. And, you know, even Gamio's half-hearted adoption of Boas's ideas is quite significant. But that, and I didn't get to say anything about that, ought to be seen more broadly as part of a sort of an international thing. That is to say, if you place then the Mexican case in the context of discussions about nationalities and the meaning of that going on in the 20s and 30s, or the sort of the development of sort of a native exoticism in the arts and a number of other things in the 1920s, then a lot of what happens in Mexico makes most sense. The problem is when all of that is attributed to a kind of virtuous indigenismo born of the revolution.
Okay. Some more questions? Yes. Just give your name very quickly and a question.
My name is Lina Blanco. I'm a student at Mills College. And I was particularly interested in these projects of nationalism that come about, and I think specifically to tie together Irwin and Kouri's talks about how this rise of nationalism, both this hypermasculinity and also this idea of mestizaje that comes about, that it feels to me, despite these great movements forward, one might think in talking about revolution could perhaps have set queer bodies and indigenous bodies back in this kind of this rise of nationalism that comes about through these figures that we see of these super masculine, hyper-masculine, macho men who might represent more indigenous roots, but when talked about only might say that they're mestizo, for example. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
I don't know if I fully got what you want us to speak to, but the nationalism, and you can tell me if I'm not answering it very well, but the nationalism that, or the notion of nationalism, the brand of nationalism that takes form after the revolution, yes, incorporates a kind of homophobia that has a certain kind of effect on queer bodies that were never accepted, but because they were operating kind of off the radar, but also were not in a position to kind of identify themselves or kind of assume ideas about what kind of desires were they may have been experiencing or may have been tempted to experience. So that's kind of what I was representing as happening with the institutionalization of homophobia in the post-revolutionary brand of nationalism. Is that what you were asking? Yep.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
If I could jump in, I'd just like to mention that in my book, I sort of deal with that idea of hypermasculinity, because it's something that has really struck me living in Mexico, that men like me, college professors, defend machismo. We're all machistas. But the idea that they openly defend it has always astounded me from the very first time that I arrived in Mexico. And I think it's a creation of 1940s cinema, frankly.
Yes, lady, woman, and yeah.
Hi, I'm Estelle Tarica. I have a question for Emilio Kouri. I sense the strong rhetorical thrust, polemical thrust of your paper, but I'm a little confused about the target. It seems to me that there was a qualitative and quantitative change in post-revolutionary racial ideologies, and I'm not sure if you're questioning the existence of that qualitative change or if you're saying that it should not be attributed to indigenismo but to something else.
Maybe a bit of both. Yes, there was a change, and I guess I'm saying maybe it's not properly to be attributed to the revolution, but rather to larger international trends, of which Mexico was no exception. And I'm also saying at the same time that I think the shift was much more gradual. That is to say that through the 20s and 30s, the language of race, and of evolution remained, alive and well in the discourse of Mexican anthropology. Yes, not, in the form that it had existed, 30, 40 years before, but nevertheless to suggest that Mexican social science and therefore public policies adopted the tenets of cultural relativism really early on is I think, misleading. I mean, you can find, even in the 40s and beyond, very much the adherence among very prominent anthropologists to these ideas. So it's a matter of degree, I guess, is what I would say. And therefore, the notion of continuity with the Porfirian, reckoning with this question, where the Porfirians had already started, questioning how far, they could take the issue of race. It seems to me, as a historian, a much more useful way of looking at it, and much more faithful to the historical record, which shows that the racial thinking of that sort didn't go away in Mexico for a long time.
Okay. Any questions on this side? This side of yes, yeah, you.
Hello, my name is Felipe Nerugo, and I'm from Tulane University. And I had a question for Mr. Mraz in regard to photography. And I understand color photography was already a technology during the Porfiriato, and its accessibility in Mexico. And I understand that there's theorists, cultural theorists, just like Garcia Conclini, that talks about how the idea of modernity preceded modernization itself. And so in regards to photography, can you talk a little bit more about that? The technology of color photography and versus black and white photography, and how that may, its inaccessibility may have a play.
Yeah, I mean, I know of no color photographs of the revolution. There are hand-tinted stuff. But by and large, and I just heard Fred Richin talk about an aperture. He said, well, I forget, 10 or 20 years ago when he went down to Rio to look at portfolios, people turned in their images and there was no color photography in there. And he asked, I don't understand. Why is that? Well, there was one color lab in all of Latin America, and that was in Brazil. So basically, no. And by and large, the sort of people that might have been experimenting with that sort of technology aren't going to be out photographing the revolution. You know, the people that are going to be photographing the revolution are by and large local studio photographers. Cruz Sanchez is the Presidente Municipal of Yautepec, the Zapatista photographer. So that sort of returns to the question I was being asked about aesthetics. Really, I see very little aesthetic development. No, that you have two kinds of cameras. One are the view cameras that have to be mounted on tripods. The other are reflex cameras that people carry around. I don't see any evidence of the use of Kodak brownies, for instance. Probably U.S. forces carried them in Brazil, but there's no evidence at all that Mexican soldiers, for instance, were carrying Kodak cameras the way that soldiers in the developed world were carrying Kodak cameras in World War I.
Thank you, and
Okay,
that's really interesting.
If I can just get us round to, just to give most people a chance to speak. One more, I think we have time for one more question. Yes. If you just stand up and there's going to be a microphone for you.
It's a general question for you. So when I heard about these three subjects, I'm Mexican, so I don't speak really well the English. So,
si quieres en español.
Puedo preguntar en español, igual pueden contestar en inglés, pero bueno, cuando escuché estos tres temas me surgió la idea de cómo están reflejados estos grandes temas de la cultura mexicana y la revolución en el cine mexicano. Y bueno, los tres temas creo que quedan muy vinculados en cómo, las preguntas son básicamente cómo está relacionado el nacionalismo y el indigenismo en el cine mexicano y cómo se ha reflejado hasta ahora. El problema de la homosexualidad escondida en el cine mexicano desde las películas de Pedro Infante y cómo se ha ido revelando ahora un poco la tendencia. Y la tercera es la importancia de la fotografía para construir a los íconos revolucionarios dentro del cine, como el compadre Mendoza y otro tipo. Bueno, las preguntas son muy amplias, quizás ustedes las pueden limitar a cosas que les interesen.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I worked a lot on, and again, here's another blurb for my book, Looking for Mexico, because what I work a lot on is precisely the representation of the Mexican Revolution, and above all, the transformation from Fernando de Fuentes, which are sort of heterogeneous histories in which the sides are identified. No, and this is in the 1930s, where a period of cultural effervescence, and I compare that to a period of cultural institutionalism with Fernandez and Figueroa, where by and large the sides disappear completely. You don't know who's on what side. And I, above all, love Enamorada, where Pedro Armendáriz first appears as a Zapatista, then he appears as a Villista, and then he appears as a federal general. So I really think that cinema is an absolutely fascinating way to see that representation of the revolution, and I see a very, very sharp break between those two periods, and I think that cinema, not the cinema of Fernando de Fuentes, because that disappeared and wasn't really, once he made Allana Rancho Grande, which was a huge hit, Vámonos con Pancho Villa and El Compadre Mendoza, which are great films, just disappeared, and he became a much more commercial filmmaker. Whereas Fernandez and Figueroa, of course, were very popular.
Thank you. The punctuality and discipline of this group is amazing. So I want to thank all the ponentes for their presentations. Let's give them some applause.